career, if you can explain what you flew and how long you were in the RAF, just to get the folks ready for the questions.
Yeah, well, 40 years of service now, so been around forever, basically. Joined in 1980, flew Jet Provost to kick off with. JP3 at Church Fenton on 7 Flying Training School, and then the JP5 for Fast Jet Group 1 Phase 1, so the first phase of the Fast Jet training system. Over to Valley, Hawk T1 at Valley in the red and white Valley aeroplanes. No what I call TAC weapons unit work. That was done down at Chivner on a separate move into what at the time was Strike Command, which was absolutely excellent. And then from there onto the Phantom, 8 years, 3 tours on the Phantom, 29 at Coningsby, Treble 1 at Lucas, and then over to 92 Squadron in Germany. The F-4 was part of a victim of the early 90s force reductions, so off to a ground tour at Valley. A couple of years on the ground supervising air-to-air missile firings, then on to the Tornado F3. Tour on the Tornado F3 and was then extended from there to be a flight commander and also the weapons leader on 5 Squadron. Then from there into effectively staff jobs and training. I've run the Red Arrows, run a couple of flying training schools, been chief instructor at Cranwell. My last job was OC operations up at Linton on Ouse, instructing on the Tucano, which is a nice way to finish an almost 40-year career in the cockpit.
Yeah, yeah. And just before, while there's still some questions coming in, what are your thoughts on the Red Arrows at the moment? Do you think they'll even get any display flying in this year at all?
That's a nightmare of a question, really. I know the guys are practicing, and I know they're going through the processes to get the display sorted and potentially be able to display. The depth of the display, the size of the display, its complexity, I think may well have been affected by COVID restrictions. And whether they have a venue to display at might equally be as questionable. But hopefully, as the summer goes, some of the sites, like the seaside sites, might be a better option to display than some of the larger fixed field sites in traditional air shows. I really don't know. I'm really hoping that the guys can get out there, and it's really nice to see a bit of jet noise when it's so quiet as it is at the moment.
Definitely. But as you can see, there's a few questions coming in now, and they'll probably keep on rolling in. So I'm going to let you loose and enjoy. And if you need me, just shout mids, and I'll turn my camera and my mic back on.
Okay, mate. So I guess it's me talking to me a little bit. So if anybody out there's listening, I am going to be reading your questions as I go and then answering them as best I can. So just drop me another line if I don't answer your question completely. Hello to James Mintram. Nice to see you, mate. And John Ellis as well. John asked if I've ever flown an F-4 from a carrier. No, I joined the Royal Air Force. I did fly the Navy's FG-1 Phantoms out of Lucas, but long after our carrier had disappeared off the face of the earth there, good old Ark Royal. It was a carrierized aeroplane, so it was different to the RAF's aeroplane, lacks navigation equipment. So the FGR-2 had an inertial nav system, very effective for low-level navigation, moving around. The FG-1, the navalized aeroplane, with a moving deck, there wasn't any way you could align the inertial navigation system in those days for navigation. So it was devoid of any real assistance bar TACAN, which required a ground station to transmit to and from to get range and bearing. So it was a very lonely place up in the north of Scotland, chasing bears in the 70s, in the 80s, in those old aeroplanes. A lot of mental dead reckoning to work out where you were. But no, so John, I haven't flown an F-4 from a carrier. Did a couple of approaches towards Roosevelt when it was in the Mediterranean once, but that was, I can hardly claim that was landings and taking off. Over to Jin Zhang. Apologies if I can't quite correctly pronounce the names there. After my most memorable dissimilar air combat sorties against other NATO fighters during the time at Wildenrath, I think one of the most memorable sorties wasn't purely dissimilar air combat. It was an affiliation sortie. Winter in Germany can be quite a challenge, but it also produces some absolutely fantastic flying days. And there was a deployment in the very late autumn, early winter, of a bunch of Corsairs, A7s from the US National Guard outfits. They came over and they then effectively spent 2 weeks flying around this sort of UK end of northern Germany. Great guys to fly with. everybody in NATO made a huge effort to get involved with these guys. And I do think one of the most memorable bits was there must have been 25 to 30 aeroplanes in a tiny fighting circle over the German countryside in perfect weather. And it was more like a scene you see from the Battle of Britain in a movie than real life intercepts. Absolutely great sortie to fly, fantastic weather. Corsairs mostly got shot down, which was what you'd expect. But there were Belgian Mirages, Belgian F-5s, Dutch F-16s were around at the time, German Phantoms, and I think a couple of German Alpha jets got mixed in as well. And it was just a fantastic 40-minute sortie out to the local area, turn and burn for about 25 minutes, run out of fuel and come home. Absolutely fantastic to do. So I hope that gives you an idea of what it was like out there. I've got a TF here. What aircraft would you most like to fly that I haven't flown before? Without a doubt, Typhoon. It's a pretty awesome piece of kit. Performance-wise, I think there's very little that is better. It's truly energy agile in that it can decelerate and accelerate at a whim. And I'd love to fly something that can pull 9G, 40 to 50,000 feet, fly low level, and just go up and down like nothing else before. So love to fly Typhoon. The generations of aeroplanes I've flown have been 60s in the Phantom and 80s-ish in the Tornado. And to fly something modern, 4.5, 5th gen would just be absolutely fantastic. For the Freckle Punny, not entirely sure if I pronounced that right either. Climb rate of a clean Tornado F3, pretty good. I can't quote you the figures from the operating manual for the aeroplane, but the way to look at this is there's two ways. One is a breaks off climb rate, which I think initially was in about the 24, 25,000 feet a minute level. Always felt to me as if it was slightly less than a clean F4. You had a better power to weight ratio with a clean F4 than you do a clean Tornado F3. So they both weigh about 40,000 pounds. The F4 would produce around about 38, 37,000 pounds of thrust, and the Tornado about 34 by the time you took into account the rating of the engines and a bit of wear and tear. So you've got a much better power to weight in a Phantom, so you've got more performance. But the other way to look at the climb rate is if you go from high speed into the vertical and unload, and the Tornado F3 was absolutely breathtaking at that. If you went from high speed, pulled the aircraft into the vertical, unloaded, you could get that 25,000 feet in literally half the time you would climbing any other way. And that maintained fairly well as well. Okay, down a little bit further then, again for Jinzheng, can I explain what the 2ATAF SOP protocols were like? With the target attacking aircraft allowed to do 360-degree horizontal turns during interception? I think the way I'd address that is to have a look at the time that we were doing this sort of stuff. It was the 80s. We had a very different view to regulation. Some of the guys I flew with when I first joined the aircraft had flown during the Second World War. And we were very much occupying forces in Germany at the time. Many people felt that. We felt the Russians were just across the border. So the 2ATAF SOPs were effectively a very good guideline on how to fight, not just the aeroplane, but the war, how to use other nations' aircraft, how to use their capabilities that may be different to your aeroplane, and they may or may not be better or worse than your aeroplane. So by combining them, you could get a really good operational effect. Likewise, it gave you how to operate in an ECM environment, in good weather, in bad weather, when there was large formations of the enemy, or whether we expected the enemy to be flying combined operations against us. So the protocols were very, very good. In terms of training, then there was an agreement throughout NATO that is still in place, although it's been amended obviously in time, which gave instruction and limitations on how to conduct affiliation training between different types, different formations, and in those days without the need to actually speak to the other formation. So that protocol was very, very useful. Down at low level, it allowed for 2 360-degree turns with a reversal. I think there was a limit of not more than 4G in there. You could do 2 180s. There were other maneuvers specified. And then at height, it gave height limitations and brackets for when you could do more complete maneuvering. I have to say, occasionally, we did more maneuvering than was in the book and the protocols, but it was always done with an aim of achieving the best you possibly can in training. Hope that answers your question there. MKMD Exploration High, just to say hello. There we go. James Mentrum, hi Minty again. Did I ever get a chance to fire a missile in training? Yes, I did. From the Phantom, I fired a Sparrow missile on the ranges at Aberporth. Great to do, interesting to do, very loud and noisy. I think one of the things when you train is you can't simulate the effect of what effectively was 1,000 kilograms of missile coming off the rail, or 500 kgs of missile coming off the rail. It has an airframe effect, and of course you're very close to the rocket when it lights, and you actually hear the thing. Absolutely fascinating to do, really rewarding. I also fired a Sidewinder off a Tornado F-3, and that was unbelievably loud. The wing-mounted pylon for the Sidewinder meant that the missile literally came past your right ear as it came off the rail, and was incredibly loud. And the thing that surprised me more than anything was on pulling the trigger, there was about a half-second pause while the missile fired up and all the information passed. When the rocket motor fired, it actually fired with the most enormous fireworks-style bang. Scared the life out of me. I thought the thing had blown up on the wing, followed almost instantly by a whoosh as it went off in front of the aircraft. And the Sidewinder was about 2 times the speed of sound, faster than the aircraft by the time it got to the end of the launch rail. So it did go off fairly fast. But it was the sound that really, really surprised me on that one. Again, John Fecklepenny. How good or otherwise did the Phantom or the Tornado handle on one engine? So we didn't do anything particularly adventurous with it. The F-4 had a reasonable thrust to weight ratio. The thing to watch in most of this was if you needed to overshoot and go around, or you needed more performance than you would get normally, then there was a finite time to reheat light, and the same on both aeroplanes. The handling, generally speaking, with the F-4, you'd use the rudder to keep the trim, the yaw trim in the center. Keeping the ball in the middle is the phrase we'd use, so the aircraft wasn't side slipping. That didn't generate any additional yaw and any additional roll as a secondary effect of yaw, and therefore the aeroplane flew pretty much as it did on 2 engines once it was trimmed out. The danger with one engine is always that when you apply power from low to very high, you get a rather large yaw effect, which has a secondary roll effect, and the aeroplane can actually maneuver while you're not expecting it. So you always have to balance the power that you're putting in with the movement of the rudder. So if you put left engine in, you need a left rudder to counter the yaw. Tornado was easier to fly on one engine simply because it had a combined stability augmentation system that effectively did some of the trimming for you. Not in the nature of an F-16, but certainly the rudder forces and the way in which the rudder worked on one engine was a lot better on a Tornado. Hope that answers your question there. Karen Shortland, as I mentioned, the red arrows. Mike mentioned the red arrows. I can't escape from it. Did I fly as part of the team? Which one would you choose if I could? My job as Red 11 was to supervise all of the team. So I was responsible for the safety of the team and its overall supervision. So I actually flew with each member of the team, flew with Synchro Lead, Synchro 2, spent a lot of time in the aeroplane with them, making sure that they were both safe and that they were doing the right thing. If I'd wanted to be part of the team, I think Red 11's the slot I'd want. I never personally really wanted to display with the red arrows. I love being with the team as their supervisor. I love the things that they do and engaging with the public and international forums across the world. But in pure display flying terms, I wasn't as attracted to it as perhaps some of the guys that do it for a living are. If I had to pick one and choose one, I think I'd pick the lead. I have a massive amount of appreciation and understanding for the complexities of leading the team. And it's something that I think I'd find as an amazing challenge. Pretty much sure that they wouldn't allow me to do that without going through the team first, and certainly not in my current rank. So sadly, that's about as far as I go, as just being Red 11. One from Mike at Aircraft Interview. How often do I get to work with the F-111s? In the 80s, quite a lot. F-111s were based up at Hayford, often deployed into some of the other airfields as well. They were a great aeroplane to work against. Didn't work with them on the same side. Generally speaking, they didn't want escorts. They were very low, very fast, and our job was to intercept them and stop them getting through. Did meet some in Scotland quite often out of Lucas. They used to love valley flying, and I do remember chasing one down in an F-4. He must have been doing about 600 odd knots, about 0.9 Mach. And we were catching him up quite nicely when I realised we were probably just supersonic in a valley up at the top of Scotland. So you could catch them in a Phantom, particularly if you had a bit of height on the way down. But they were great to fly with. The big thing that was the difference was we could intercept them, shoot them, and catch them, but they then could sustain high-speed cruise for about an hour and a half, something we just couldn't keep up with. So that's all right for Mike there. Back into Freckle Punny again. I hope I'm saying that right. Which Soviet-Russian fighter would you have feared most in the F-4? To be perfectly honest, I don't think we feared any of them. We had confidence in ourselves. The one that was without a doubt the most challenging to face, certainly at the end of my time in the Phantom, was when Flanker was coming out, the Su-27. And I think we pretty much acknowledged that airframe to airframe, that was fairly much unbeatable in an F-4. What we did have was the advantage of a very comprehensive and effective radar system, 2 seats and a nav in the back who, without doubt, was worth his weight in gold. A lot of the complexity of operating, particularly in Germany, was weather, complex situations made worse by conditions, and 2 seats was definitely an advantage in those days out there. I did have the opportunity when the war came down to fight Fulcrum. Again, its manoeuvrability in the close-in fight was far better than an F-4, as you would expect, being the generation difference that there is. But in fact, in terms of weapon system, they were not really comparable or anything to fear, is the way I describe that. Charmingly cynical, quite like that. I did a couple of red flag exercises. So the question is, did I do any red flag exercises? How do we fare against the USAF? I've flown about 5 or 6 red flags, a couple with the F-4. In the 80s, the single-seat F-16, F-15, and the early varieties of the F-15, the A models, were not that user-friendly to the crews. And generally speaking, in the F-4, we did fairly well against them. I think the F-16 was the easiest to do well against because in those days they were a Sidewinder-equipped day visual fighter with no radar missile and a pulse-only radar set. So generally speaking, you could shoot them before you entered the fight, where their performance was definitely better in a turning fight. The later red flags I did were with the Tornado F-3, where the US systems were far more modern, far more compatible with modern operations and far more capable. But again, the F-3 with Link 16, data link, and its comprehensive weapon system was still a fairly formidable platform, particularly at night, particularly in a large, complex environment. And the first one I did with 5 Squadron, we had a 5-to-1 kill ratio in our favour of parts of the exercise, which was far better than anybody else had across the ballpark. We've also done 2 red flags as Red Air, where we've worked with the aggressor squadron as the opposition, giving us a real chance to have a look at how the NATO fighters fought. And that was fascinating to see how they dealt with us simulating what we would consider to be the opposition's manoeuvres. Hope that answers your question there. MKMD, again, highlights of flying the Phantom, what were mine, particular memories. Thousands of memories, really. I loved flying the aeroplane. Germany, as a 2.5-year tour, was absolutely fantastic. The low-level air defence environment and the role was absolutely fabulous. And I think that's where most of the memories of operating the aeroplane were. And I'd say that was the highlights of flying the jet. It was a great station at Wildenrath, 2 great squadrons, 19 and 92. Really challenging, complex job that we did extremely well. And we're very proud of that. And against a very credible opposition as well. Outside of that, I actually liked my first tour at Coningsby on 29 Squadron. And that was learning to fly the aeroplane and becoming familiar with it. And there is a bit of reward when you start off flying an aeroplane that is massive compared to a Hawk. It's big, it's heavy. It really was quite intimidating to fly. It had some vices that if you didn't respect it, it would bite you. And as you get more confident with it over your first couple of years on type, you become more familiar with it. It's a real pilot's aeroplane. And once you understand it and you understand how to fly it, it's a great piece of kit. And that tour on 29 was really a fantastic learning experience to become familiar with the aeroplane. Really, really enjoyed that. Hope that answers your question there. What have we got here then? Zigzag Ground Zero. Favorite air warfare movie? Nations, RAF, nuclear missions, weapons, attacking Warsaw, CPO. I don't really have any massively favourite movies from the modern eras. If I'm being brutally honest, Battle of Britain is probably my favourite movie. It's got some great scenes and some fantastic flying. I think that's pretty awesome all round. If I was going to pick a non-air warfare movie, by the way, the Yangtze incident's one of my favourites as well. Doesn't really answer your question, but just outside of my scope, really. James Bintram saying thank you. Thank you again, James. That's great. Ranges of the older marks of Sparrow and Sidewinder. Can't really give you any information on that and how we used it, as some of those marks are still used around the world. Needless to say, as missile generations have got better, then the ranges and the PK, the percentage kill survival rates in the missile and its success have got better. Can't really say much more than that, mate. Sorry about that. Hope you're well as well. Back to Jin Zhang. Did we have to employ the rat to restart for engine flame out on the Phantom? Rat on an F-4 in the UK ones was an electrical device. So if an engine flamed out, there were several ways of restarting it. The first was you could use the generator off the other engine. And in fact, you didn't actually need the generator off the other engine. All you needed was forward flow of air through the engine. The engine would windmill. You generally had to speed up a little bit to get it to windmill at an appropriate rate. You turn the fuel on, you hit the ignition system, which could be powered by the other engine. And generally speaking, the engine would light, and that was quite good. If the engine didn't light under those circumstances, generally when you were at height, the best way was to come back down to lower level. And then because the UK F4 had starting systems that you could use in the air on one of the engines, that was potentially an option. But generally speaking, it was lower the nose, build the speed up, off you go for the other. The rat itself would be deployed and used if we had a total electrics failure. And for the Navy Phantoms, they didn't actually have a battery either. So if you had a total electrics failure in a FGR2, F4M, then you had electrics running, there was a battery that powered stuff, and you had a bit of time, particularly night, low level, it wasn't too frightening. You had a double generator failure in an FG1 with no battery, the cockpit would just go absolutely and completely black. And the only thing we had was a tiny light on an electrical cable and a clip that I used to sit down by my right elbow on the side of the aeroplane and point at just the attitude indicator. And you would hope that there was sufficient gyro rundown in the attitude indicator to give you a bit of attitude to pull away from the ground. Once you'd done that, your left hand, I think it would go out, and there was a rat operating lever which you pull down, put the rat into the airflow, and that would give you your electrics and, most importantly, your lighting and instruments back. One of the biggest things to watch for that is it had a relatively low airspeed limit. So if you were going fast and chasing something and it all went dark, with the electrics going off, then you'd have to climb away, slow down before you could put it out. And that was normally a heart-wrenching minute or so while everything came under control and the lights came back on. Hope that answers your question. Mike Child, did I ever fly the F4J? How different was it to the UK variants? No, I didn't. I was around when it came in, and a lot of my friends went to fly it. Lots of them liked it, particularly the pilots. J79 had a better performance up high and a better feel to it at height, where I think the FGR2, the K and the M models with the SPAY engines were better and more powerful down low. That's about as far as I can go on the differences. I was always an avid fan of the F4K, the FG1 Navy version. I've no idea why. It felt a little better. It had slightly different slats and flats to the FGR2. I just thought it was a better, nicer aeroplane. Slightly lighter as well, which did give you a touch of performance. So I hope that's okay, Mike. Adam Steele, how do we engage the reheat and thrust reverts in a Tornado? F3 reheat was different to the Phantom. So in a Phantom, you went forward in the mil power range from idle to full power, and you came across a very physical gate. You could not go forward with the throttles any further. You then rocked both throttles to the left outboard. They went through a gating system, and that lit the reheat to minimum reheat, and then you could go from minimum reheat to full reheat backwards and forwards, and that gave you variable thrust in the reheat range. To return to military power, you brought them all the way back to min reheat, rocked them inbound. Tornado was more like the Lightning, and you can tell it was a UK design, so subtly different to the US design of the Phantom. Tornado had two clips, so you'd push full power in the military range till you fell to restriction. But to go through that restriction, you just needed more force, and that put it into min reheat. And from there, you could go to full reheat, back to minimum reheat. There was actually a stop at minimum reheat and two little levers. You pop the levers down, and then the throttles came back into the military range, deselecting the reheat. So it was a very sensible system. For thrust reverse in the Tornado, if you were in the mil range, then you rock the throttles outboard, and that gave the thrust reverse buckets. You would normally do that from idle, go to thrust reverse, the thrust reverse would kick in, and then you could use all of your military power with thrust reverse. The issue with the difference between the two, converting from one type to the other, and this has happened to a couple of friends of mine, is that if you forgot you were in a Tornado and you went back in terms of your established patterns for operating to that of the F-4, you'd go to full power on the brakes in a Tornado, let the brakes off, select full reverse thrust and go rapidly backwards towards the end of the runway. And I have seen that happen a couple of times. It also doesn't do the thrust reverse buckets any good if you put full power into them while you're selecting them. So you just had to be really careful how you did that and how you balance those things against each other. And I think just not forgetting that you're in the aeroplane that you're now in and that the Phantom was your previous type is a really important thing. I guess don't relax too much is the way I'd look at that. Okay, how are we doing? Past Mike's next little question. Jacqueline Oliver. Oh, thanks. One of the guys at EMU asked. Great to see you, and thanks for coming along and listening. You asked how much the Wizzo in the F-4 did in spotting other aircraft, given the much smaller field of view in the back seat. The general way of operating the aeroplane was the Wizzo's job was to have his head down in the radar, operate the longer range tactical battle, use the radar, and get us into a place where the visual fight was. Then the guy in the front would do the visual fight looking out of the window. When we were in the long range fight, before we got there, then the guy in the front would be doing lots of the lookout. The only thing the back seater had was a much better view behind. So it was expected that the work cycle of the navigator would be broken at times by a good check of the 6 o'clock, particularly if the threat environment was getting higher. So as we got closer and closer to emerge with the target, then I would expect the back seater to look out more. If we were engaging somebody, then quite often he would have his head out around the back talking what the guy behind was doing, because frankly from the front your field of view right behind you was limited. Hope that answered your question, Jocelyn. Back to Freckle Penny. I hope I'm saying that correct. Please let me know if I'm not. The F-Tornado, the F-4 and the Tornado F-3, were they both retired too soon? Really difficult question. From a pure pilot's perspective, I think the F-4 was. You know, with the Greeks, the Turks ran the F-4s on along with the Germans well beyond the date we did. Tornado F-3 was a very capable system. If you took pure aviation platforms, then I think the Tornado F-3 could still be viable today if necessary with the weapon systems it had. But you have to take a balance against capability and cost. And I think the decisions to retire both Aeroplanes compared to what was coming in to replace them, what was out there to be credible, and of course the limited amount of taxpayers' money, the decisions were definitely the correct decisions. Sad as a pilot, though I was to see the F-4 go, it was about the right time to do it. I'd certainly not to want to operate one as long as both the Germans and the Greeks have done it, even though I have a love for the airframe itself. Khalid questions. How many dogfights in total did you have during the 40 years career? Live dogfights, 0. Lots of air policing, lots of running around, but the F-4 UK was never put into an operational theatre where a dogfight could take place. Practice ones, we had to require a currency in dissimilar air combat training and affiliation, which would generally mean you'd be doing something along those lines at least once or twice a week. So all of my frontline career was spent doing that whenever I was on a frontline aircraft type. I have no idea what the actual number is. Back to Ying Zhen, radar gun sight, the Phantom could do high angle deflection gunshots, or did it require the target 6 o'clock in order to get a radar lock for the guns kill? Massive amount of computations in the gun sight. It had all the capability to do high angle, multi-angle and head-on gunshot calculations. The radar in pulse mode at height would work very well. Down against the ground it wasn't so brilliant, and it had a reversionary lead computing optical system that was based roughly on those of the 50s that could revert there as well. It was a good gun sight. It had its limitations, and the limitations, much like many gun sights that don't give you live bullet prediction as we see on modern aeroplanes, was that you have to be in a stable situation and have to have been stable, tracking the target in exactly the place where you want the rounds to go for a period of time. Generally speaking, about 1 to 1.5 seconds for all of the computations to settle down and for the sight to be accurate. That doesn't sound like very long, but in combat, getting 3 or 4 seconds of pure tracking of the pipper on the target is a really complex thing to do. So that was the hardest bit of the lot, not necessarily using the system, but getting it to stay there. And when the guy in front of you obviously didn't want to cooperate. Rob Feely, Do I still fly for fun? What's my favourite airframe, and which airframe does the best breakfast? Airfield does the best breakfast. Um, I don't fly for fun. I've had a couple of periods where I've done ground tours, and I haven't flown for fun there either. And I don't know why I don't. I guess it's because since I started flying, I've always had an operational role or a task or a job to do, teaching people flying and all of that. And when you've done that and you've flown very high performance aircraft for 40 odd years, jumping in an aeroplane to me at the moment, and I will caveat this with I may not get another flying tour and I may change my mind in a couple of years' time, but paying my own money to fly something that doesn't have anything like the performance of the aeroplanes I've flown or flown recently doesn't really appeal to me as much as perhaps you might sound. Aerobatics in a pit special might be something completely different. That might be something I'd like to go down. But at the moment, no, I don't fly for fun really. I've just had 2 years flying the Tucano, which was great fun, and I would describe that as flying for fun. Really lovely aeroplane, great to fly. For me, very simplistic and straightforward to fly and operate. It does have some gentle vices, which is why you don't see them teaching on civilian flying schools. But for a fast jet operator with a lot of experience, and any of the military guys who've done a frontline tour and gone into instruction, it was a perfect platform for that, and really quite a nice, friendly aeroplane. People talk about aeroplanes talking to you. The F-4 used to talk to you if you pulled too hard, got too close to the edge of the performance envelope. You could feel it from the aeroplane. And without a doubt, the Tucano was very similar. It had a good feel. You didn't necessarily need to look in to know roughly how fast you were doing, what the airframe was doing in terms of performance, what G you were pulling. So fun to fly, pure fun, without a doubt. Tucano is great as an aeroplane. I think the most fun, the one I describe as a little sports car, will be the Hawk, and particularly in the RAFAT low-level aerobatics role, was just absolutely fantastic. If I was to pick a favourite airframe rather than a fun-to-fly airframe, it would be the F-4. I have a very soft spot for that aeroplane. Proper pilot's aeroplane, and without a doubt a challenge, but incredibly rewarding to fly. Which airfield does the best breakfast? I haven't really done breakfast at Airfield, to be honest. Certainly not around the bazaars. I could probably give you a list of the best airfields and military bases that have good bars, but certainly not breakfast. Sorry about that, Rob. Charmingly cynical again. Continuously hear RAF doing well against USAF in red flag. Do I think that the USAF doesn't try hard so as not to show the capabilities to other nations, or does the RAF training want the results? Yeah, it's a really difficult one. I've never met a USAF operator who has not tried his best to use the capability of his aeroplane, and I would say that's what they were doing at red flag. We're a small air force. We can afford to take the very, very best. We train them incredibly well. We have, I still believe, the best training system in the world, without a doubt. And we have some of the best operators in the world and one of the best atmospheres in which to operate. Our people are truly great, and they're supported truly well. That generates a small but highly effective air force. The USAF, on the other hand, has thousands of pilots spread over an enormous demographic. It can't be so picky in its quality. It can't be so picky in its training. And therefore, I think you end up with a much larger organisation, and I'd be biased and say with a slightly lower operating standard. That stands out in small, intense operating exercises such as red flag, where you are looking at a really complex environment and you want your very best people to go there. I would say the USAF weapons school graduates are some of the best operators I've come across. Most squadrons will have one. If you get them in a forum of several, they are an incredibly talented and skillful bunch of people. So I think it's just the difference in the two nations' air forces that gives you that difference. And I would say the RAF was far better anyway. TF, what was different about aerial refueling between the Phantom and the Tornado? Position of the probe was the big one. In the Tornado, you pretty much see the probe. The Phantom, it used to come out over your right shoulder and was invisible from the front cockpit. So in Tornado, the nav on both aeroplane types would help talk you into the refueling bracket and talk you into the contact. In the Phantom, you had to rely 100% on the nav because you simply couldn't see where the basket and the refueling probe were at the moment. That was critical to getting engagement sorted. You could pick it up with experience. There were a few skills and tricks to use. I used to run the standby compass, which was on the canopy, down the cable of the basket. That put you in the right line. And then just before contact, if the basket moved out, you knew you were in about the right place. But the nav would give you a commentary all the way down. With the Tornado, the probe was on the other side, lower, nearer the nose, so trimming the aeroplane was a secret in there. And I would always trim the Tornado slightly out of trim, so that with a little bit of right trim, so that when you got the basket connected, it was in trim before you got there, and that worked quite well. Different sides of the aeroplane as well, left and right, and it was a little bit more complex in the Tornado to get everything spot on, simply because of the probe position. I hope that answers your question there. Where are we on now? Just trying to find the next one. Apologies if I miss out the odd question. I'm just trying to catch up with the technology. So Zeitgeist X, and charmingly cynical. Everyone and their mother claims to beat the USAF at red flag. Indian press claim their Su-30 dominated F-22s, for example. Typhoons bragged about winning against the F-22. Yeah, you're right, mate. Again, it's the environment, as I hope I've outlined there, of which is the better aeroplane against which is the better scenario and what the crews are doing with it at the time. And again, what's the outcome that the F-22 is trying to generate? How many are there? How big are the packages they're facing? Visual merge scenario. Again, aeroplanes perform in different ways. It's a combined weapons package that gets you into a fight and gets you victory. So I think there's a question a bit further down about the F-35, good or bad for the Navy and the Air Force. If you start looking at the modern generation airframes as simply an airframe, does it turn at this G, does it turn in this way, does it do this, then you can quite easily differentiate one slightly better and the worse. And if you restrict the aeroplane in its weapon system or where it has to fight, you can do the same. If you take them as overall weapon systems, without a doubt, the 5th generation and the 4.5 generation aeroplanes are absolutely phenomenal. And I think we need to remember to consider them as the package, not just the airframe, and particularly for F-35, which is an integrated package of capabilities far beyond anything else that's out there. Gabriel Bassine, I think it is, enjoying the detail of this Q&A. Thank you very much. Hopefully people are being informed sufficiently. I've got a Joran Janssen from Dutch Caribbean Curacao. Been diving in the Dutch Caribbean at Curacao, mate. Really great place. Do I experience a lot of differences in the air forces we flew DACT against? Any favourites? Yeah, every nation does its own thing its own way. They all have their own characters, and many operate aeroplanes in different ways. I think the ones that would stand out as favourites were generally those that came as a complete package, not just the aviation piece, but the Air Force itself. I have a really, really soft spot for the Danish Air Force. I really love those guys. They are very capable people, small Air Force, and they're absolutely great hosts if ever you go to fly with them. So the Danes, particularly the F-16 outfit in Aalborg in the 80s, was just a phenomenal bunch of guys. Phenomenal. Right, back to Zigzag Ground Zero. JATO rocket assisted or zero length launch systems. Should we be reinvestigating it versus building the Harrier? I don't know, mate, is the honest answer. It's an interesting one. The Germans experimented it with starfighters. But in the end, what you've got to have is a system that is valid and viable to operate the aeroplane, and operate the aeroplane 4, 5, 6 times a day, and be able to rearm it, reoperate, re-weapon it, refuel it, re-oxygen it, and go again. Without a doubt, the best way for doing that is some form of airfield and some form of normal system that doesn't rely on huge consumables to get it working. Without a doubt, vertical takeoff gets you back on the boat or gets you into your hide really effectively. Harrier for close air support in the 80s was an absolutely phenomenal platform. Operating close to the battlefront, its ability to operate and hit the enemy as a CAS platform was virtually second to none. F-35 vertical short takeoff, absolutely. There's variants of both. We've elected for the vertical landing version, short takeoff. Saves carrier weight, saves a lot of airframe bits and pieces, but you lose a bit of performance for the vertical fan. So I'm not convinced that zero launch or JATO would make any difference whatsoever, if I was being perfectly honest. Back to Xinjiang. How reliable is the AUG-12 in the Phantom? Could it easily be notched by fighters going abeam? It was a very, very reliable platform. Towards the end of the life of the aeroplane, it was starting to show its wear, and the wear in reality wasn't with the radar itself. It was with the line replaceable units and the cards within the radar that were taken out for servicing and put back in. we had a program in the 80s where we re-gold plated all of the connections, which brought reliability back enormously. Yep, the radar could be notched. It was pulse Doppler radar, and at low level, where the pulse set wouldn't give you targets in the beam due to ground clutter, it was possible to notch it. The notch wasn't particularly wide, and as a raw radar feed, it was possible to see guys very close to the beam at low level. But yeah, it was possible to notch it. Buccaneers were very good at it in my experience. Some of the other single seat stuff wasn't quite so good. Carp comment, what was the easiest to land, an F-4 or the Tornado? Without a doubt, the Tornado was easiest to land. Head-up display with a velocity vector showed you where you were going. It didn't have any of the quirkiness of an F-4. So in an F-4, to fly the aeroplane in a landing configuration, you didn't point at the numbers, you pointed the aeroplane at the sky. You flew an angle of attack of 19 units, which meant the aeroplane vector was through, generally speaking, the instrument panel. So what you did in terms of flying it was you directed your body at the numbers, which wasn't where the aeroplane was pointing, and you did that by holding the aircraft angle of attack at 19 units with the stick, and then changing the power setting to change the vector in which you were going. Unlike any other aeroplane I think we fly nowadays, where you effectively point it where you want to go and change the power, then the flying angle of attack method has you using the stick to hold the angle of attack, and the power changed where you went. Once you mastered that technique, it was a really simple technique to use, and I actually thought landing the F-4 was great. Didn't kick off drift. If it was got an aircraft carrier undercarriage, you just landed it sideways, and it was a very straightforward aeroplane to land. But it probably took 2 years to really master that technique. Tornado was more like a hawk. It was more like you pointed it at the pace you were going. The stick gave you the touchdown point. In reality, you could do that with power giving you the speed. And I found it was easier to land, but perhaps slightly harder to land accurately. Quirks of cockpit designs. The F-4 was an ergonomic nightmare with all the stuff that you really wanted to use, particularly in bad weather, which would be really nice if you didn't have to move your head, keep away from disorientation. Then in the F-4, it generally was somewhere behind your left elbow, particularly the instrument landing system was behind your right elbow. So you'd have to swap hands and look down at the cockpit consoles when you're trying to fly in cloud accurately, which is just not what you want to be doing. Tornado was a lot more ergonomically sound, a lot better designed cockpit. The only one probably with Tornado that was a bit of a quirk from design was that the head-up display could be selected to either indicated airspeed or Mach number, so relative to speed of sound, but that was a manual selection. So if you were chasing somebody at low level, and the Tornado would go very fast down on the deck at low level, it was quite easier to go through the sound barrier without realizing it, because all you saw was a speed in knots, and around about 660 knots on a cold day is certainly supersonic. So unless you remembered to select Mach, it was quite easy to end up supersonic, and that generally results in a quiet chat with your boss and a few noise complaints. Right, Minty again. What happens next? Will I get another flying tour? A super interesting ground tour, or am I definitely going to retire? 40 years is a fairly long time to be in the military, so retirement is not that far away from me. I've done 3 flying tours as a wing commander. You generally get 1, sometimes 2, so I've been very lucky with that. I don't think they'll offer me another one, so I probably won't get another flying tour. I do have another job to go to, and the next job I'm going to is in the Military Aviation Authority. I'm going to run the fixed wing assurance department of the MAA, or the wing commander in charge of fixed wing assurance for a while. I'll see how that goes and see how that defines what happens next. The great thing about the military is, whilst it's one employer, the jobs are as different as they possibly can be. So give it a couple of years in this environment, there'll be something perhaps very interesting coming up next. Do I retire? I'll retire when I either feel too old or they can't find me anything interesting to do, which isn't quite yet. Hope that answers your question there, mate. Doug, do I think having an F-4 carrier base available during the Falklands would have made a significant difference? If we'd had a big flat top with the aeroplanes on, absolutely. I would have a Buccaneer capability. You'd have a more comprehensive fighter capability. But we have to understand that with one carrier, potentially 8 Buccaneers, 10 Phantoms, probably at absolute most, it's a very limited capability if you can't support it with a second carrier. So yes, it would probably have made a difference. I don't think it would have made a massive difference. It would still need to be supported with the key other facets of Harrier carriers, etc. I'd really like to have a couple of major aircraft carriers. That would be really useful. Again, back to the Freckle Penny. Ever fired a gun on the F-4 on the Tornado? Yep, fired both. You can hear both. The F-4 20mm is without a doubt the most fantastic gun to fire. Gatling gun, not particularly accurate, but if I want something to shoot the enemy, I don't kind of matter where it splays. It had quite a large footprint at 300 yards, and that was pretty good in my view. It fired 100 rounds a second, and that was just pretty awesome to shoot, to be perfectly honest. 27mm gun in the Tornado, bigger round, much more accurate round, so the rounds all tended to go in the same place. There wasn't the spread. The sighting system was more advanced and a bit better because it's a generation further on. So yeah, that would be a great gun to use probably for real, but just for the fun of firing a 20mm. And I note there it's pronounced, is that Pooney? So the Feckle Pooney. Okay, mate, thanks for that. Hopefully I won't get it wrong again. Charmingly cynical, flying for fun. Would I try something like a Red Bull Air Race? I'd love to have a go. I've flown the Red Bull Air Race simulator and found it absolutely great fun, and ended up with about a second off some of the, I won't say winning times, but some of the race times that I've seen. But it's a lot easier in the simulator. You can have a bit of a disregard for your own safety in that as well. Yeah, I'd give it a go. It'd be great fun to do. Not entirely sure I'm young enough to fit in with the good-looking, handsome G-pullers, but I'd certainly like to have a go at it. Over to the Iceman. What's the fastest I've been? It's just jumped. What's the fastest I've seen in an F3 or an F4? It's always a difficult question, and one that's often asked. In terms of pure speed over the ground relative to the speed of sound at high level, 1.6 Mach in both aeroplanes. I tried to get an F4 to Mach 2 and it wouldn't do it. I think I got an F3 just above 1.6, but I was running out of will, patience and speed. So not quite Mach 2, but well past the supersonic. The F3 was starting to go well. Where you really sense speed, and where I think speed is most appropriate, is down low. So in the thicker air, indicated airspeed is more important. I saw 800 knots in an F4 at about 6,000 feet coming down the hill in Dechi, running away from a starfighter who was particularly trying to get us. I'd run out of weapons and was out of fuel, so we had to get home as quickly as we could, and we ended up at about 800 knots. In an F3, I've seen about 100 knots faster than that down at low level. Very impressive aeroplane. Once you get through the drag caused by going supersonic, the F3's dynamics, the swept wing, the ramp system on the engines keeps the airflow perfect, and the aeroplane really does accelerate phenomenally in the thicker air down low. High bypass engines are optimized for down there, and it really does go quickly. Hope that answered your question there.
So, Mids, I don't know if you can see me now, because we're going to start to wrap up, but if you want to scroll down, maybe pick 2 more questions, and then I'll jump in to wrap up.
Lovely. Okay, mate. I'll jump here past a few there. There's lots of questions, so I can't answer them all. Adam Steele, could an F3 pilot jump straight into a GR model and flight? The answer, basically, a little bit of speed adjustment on how the aeroplane flies for certain limits, but yes, you could. Basically the same aeroplane, flies very similar. Likewise, going back the other way, yeah. But there's a big difference between flying an aeroplane and operating an aeroplane. And to be effective in operating the aeroplane, using the weapon system and in the role in which it's designed, then no, it's not just a straightforward job of jumping across. Generally, converting to one type to another has a 4 or 6 months operational conversion unit required, and then probably another 6 months to a year work upon a squadron before you're competent across the variety of skill sets that's needed. So airframe-wise, yes, but in role terms, no, there's a lot different to it. We'll go down a little bit further on that one then. I'll very quickly, I'd just say for Yuri Janssen, any thoughts on the Dutch? Love the Dutch. Great people, about the same as the Danes. I just thought the Danes' hospitality was a fraction better, but only a fraction. Love the Dutch people, they're great. Brian D, holy moly, that's fast. Yeah, it is, mate. Very, very fast aeroplane down low. Final question then is from the Feckle Pooney. If I got that right, mate. Feckle Pooney. What's the most difficult to intercept, Concorde or U2? Interesting question. Height is a big thing, so I wouldn't get the aeroplane up there on either of those. I can't comment on the modern systems like Typhoon, but you certainly have to use a missile to shoot up. Concorde did much of the computation for you because of its speed, so that would help the missile get up there. U2, slow speed, thin air, generally very high, was very challenging to shoot down. So Concorde, not quite so much of a challenge. U2 was a challenge. What I would say is getting behind either of them was unbelievably challenging and probably very unlikely. So I hope that answered your questions there. And if you're happy with that, Mike, I'd like to answer just one final one, which says basically would I open to flying a Phantom again if given the chance. Colin Foundations is getting an F-4D back in condition. I would absolutely love the chance to fly the aeroplane again. I think I can still remember the checks as well. Loved it to pieces. I hope that answered everybody's questions. I hope that was interesting for everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant Q&A, Mids. The detail in some of the detail in your answers from the questions was absolutely brilliant. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone who came in the comments and asked a question, and hopefully you enjoyed it. And again, thank you to you, Mids, for coming on and sharing all that detail and a few more stories. It's been a real pleasure. Okay, Mids, if you just stay on for 2 seconds on Skype just for a quick debrief, that'll be brilliant.
Okay, mate. Are you happy for me to get off YouTube?
Yep, that's fine.
Lovely.